October 1944. The Allied invasion of Europe, which had stormed the beaches of Normandy with such fury in June, was grinding to a bloody, muddy halt. The German Wehrmacht, supposedly broken, had stiffened its spine at the border of the fatherland. The autumn rains had turned the French fields into a quagmire that sucked the boots off infantrymen and bogged down the supply trucks. In the headquarters of the Third Army, General George S. Patton, old blood and guts, the most feared and aggressive commander in the American arsenal, was staring at a map that offered him no good options. He needed to punch a hole in the German line. He needed speed. He needed violence of action. But most of all, he needed tanks. He was running out of armor. His white tank crews were being chewed up by the superior German Panthers and Tigers, or simply exhausted by the relentless pace of the advance. Patton was desperate. And in his desperation, he was forced to look at a reserve force that the War Department had kept on a leash for the entire war. A force that many generals in Washington believed was a waste of steel and gasoline. Waiting in the staging areas, shivering in the damp European autumn, was the 761st Tank Battalion. They were fresh. They were eager. And they were black. To understand the weight of this moment, you have to understand what the United States Army thought of these men. In the 1940s, the official military doctrine, supported by scientific reports from the Army War College, stated explicitly that African Americans lacked the technical intelligence to operate complex machinery. Tanks were the cutting edge of ground warfare, 30 tons of steel, high explosive shells, complex engines, and radios. The Army believed that a black man simply did not have the brainpower to master the mechanics of an M4 Sherman, nor the courage to stay inside a metal box while people were shooting at it. They were viewed as laborious, not warriors. So, for 2 long years, while white tank units were rushed through basic training and sent to the front in a matter of months, the men of the 761st were held back in the United States. They were trained, and then trained again, and then trained some more. They spent years at Camp Claiborne in Louisiana and Camp Hood in Texas, mastering every bolt, every gear, and every tactic of armored warfare. They became surgeons with their 76mm guns. They could strip an engine in the dark. They drove their tanks until the tracks wore thin. They were arguably the best trained tank unit in the entire United States Army, simply because the Army refused to deploy them. They had to be perfect just to be considered present. But their war was not just against the targets on the range. It was against the country they were preparing to defend. In the neighboring towns around their training camps, they were subjected to the brutal apartheid of the Jim Crow South. They were beaten by local police. They were shot at by white civilians. One of their officers, a young lieutenant named Jackie Robinson, who would later become a baseball legend, was court-martialed simply for refusing to move to the back of a military bus. The 761st learned to fight with a rage that simmered just beneath the surface. Their motto was "Come out fighting." It was not just a slogan, it was a promise. Now, they were in France. They had finally been called up. Not because the Army had a change of heart, but because Patton had a gap in his line. On November 2nd, 1944, the 761st assembled in a muddy field near the town of St. Nicholas, Delaware Port. The air was cold. The engines of their Shermans were idling, a low, mechanical growl that vibrated in their chests. They saw a staff car approach, flying the flags of a 3-star general. George Patton stepped out. Patton was a complicated man. He was arrogant, profane, and held many of the prejudices of his time. But he was also a pragmatist. He wanted to kill Germans, and he did not care who pulled the trigger. He climbed onto the hull of a half-track and looked down at the sea of black faces looking back at him. These men knew his reputation. They knew he was a hard man. They waited for him to insult them, or to give them a pep talk filled with condescension. Instead, Patton gave them one of the most famous speeches of the war. He looked them in the eye, his high-pitched voice cutting through the wind. "Men, you are the first Negro tankers to ever fight in the American Army. I would never have asked for you if you were not good. I have nothing but the best in my army. I do not care what color you are as long as you go up there and kill those Kraut son of a bitches. Everyone has their eyes on you and is expecting great things from you. Most of all, Your race is looking forward to your success. Do not let them down, and damn you, do not let me down. It was a challenge. It was a burden. Patton was telling them the brutal truth. They were not just soldiers, they were representatives. If they failed, if they broke and ran, it would be used as proof for the next 100 years that black men could not fight. The entire future of integration in the military rested on how they performed in the next few weeks. The men of the 761st climbed into their tanks. These machines, the M4 Shermans, were the workhorses of the American Army, but they were flawed. They were tall, thinly armored, and ran on gasoline. The Germans called them Ronsenleiters because they lit up the first time you hit them. Against the German Panzer and Tiger tanks, which had thicker armor and bigger guns, a Sherman was a coffin. To fight in a Sherman required a suicidal level of bravery. You had to get close. You had to flank. You had to be faster than the enemy because you certainly were not stronger. As the hatch covers clanged shut, sealing them inside the steel bellies of their beasts, the men of the 761st knew that the training wheels were off. There were no more simulations. The enemy waiting for them in the Saar Basin was not a cardboard target. It was the 11th Panzer Division, the Ghost Division. Battle-hardened veterans of the Russian front. Killers who knew how to destroy a Sherman tank with their eyes closed. The engines roared to life. The tracks churned the French mud. The Black Panthers were moving out. They were rolling toward the town of Morville-les-Vicq, a heavily fortified German stronghold. The white infantry units they were supporting looked at them with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. They had never seen black tankers before. They wondered if these guys would hold the line when the 88mm shells started flying. They were about to find out. The 761st was not just going to hold the line. They were going to drive right through it. They were about to embark on a 183-day continuous combat tour, a record that few white units could match without rotation. They would face the freezing hell of the Battle of the Bulge. They would crack the Siegfried Line. And they would do it all while knowing that the German prisoners they captured would be treated better by the US military police than they were. But before the first shell was fired, every man in that unit had to make a choice. They were sitting in a metal box, loaded with high explosives, driving toward an enemy with superior technology. They knew that one direct hit meant burning to death. I want to ask you a question, and I want you to be honest in the comments. If you were in their position, knowing your own country treated you like a second-class citizen, knowing the enemy had better tanks, and knowing that one spark would turn your vehicle into an incinerator, would you have the courage to close that hatch and drive forward? Or would you hesitate? Drop a comment below, ride or run. Let us see who is really ready for war. The morning of November 8, 1944, did not break, it leaked into existence. The sky over the Saar Basin was a bruise of grey clouds, spitting a freezing rain that turned the roads into rivers of sludge. Inside the M4 Shermans of the 761st, the temperature was dropping, but the air was thick with the smell of sweat, diesel fumes, and the metallic tang of fear. The battalion was moving out to attack the German-held towns of Vic-sur-Seille and Morville-les-Vicq. This was it. The experiment was live. For the white infantrymen of the 26th Division, the Yankee Division, huddled in their foxholes, the sound of the approaching engines was a question mark. They had been told they were getting tank support. They had also been told, through the grapevine of rumors and prejudice, that colored troops would cut and run at the first sign of trouble. They watched the Shermans lumber out of the mist, the white stars painted on their olive-drab armor, and they waited to see if the men inside were soldiers or liabilities. The Germans, dug into the hillsides with their terrifying 88mm anti-tank guns, did not care about the race of the drivers. To them, a Sherman was just a target. As the lead tanks of the 761st crested a ridge, the German trap snapped shut. The air ripped apart. An 88mm shell travels faster than the speed of sound. You do not hear the gunfire until after the shell has already passed you, or killed you. The ground erupted. The lead tanks were bracketed by explosions. Machine gun fire hammered against the hulls, sounding like a handful of gravel thrown against a tin roof. In that split second, 2 years of training kicked in. The panic that the War Department had predicted never happened. The 761st did not freeze. They maneuvered. They returned fire. The radio chatter was not filled with screams. It was filled with coordinates and targeting orders. But the terrain was a nightmare. The Germans had felled massive trees across the roads, creating roadblocks laced with mines. To stop a tank column on a narrow road is to kill it. If the lead tank hits a mine, the whole column is stuck, sitting ducks for the artillery zeroed in on that exact spot. It was here, in the chaos of the first hour of combat, that Staff Sergeant Ruben Rivers made a decision that would become legend. Rivers was a quiet man from Oklahoma, part Cherokee, part black. He was the kind of soldier who did not say much but whom everyone watched. Seeing the column halted by a massive roadblock and taking heavy fire, Rivers did not wait for the engineers. He did not wait for orders. He opened his hatch. He climbed out of his tank. Imagine the insanity of this. He stepped out of 30 tons of armored protection into a storm of bullets and shrapnel. With a steel cable in his hand, he ran toward the roadblock. Bullets kicked up mud around his boots. Mortars exploded nearby, the shockwaves rattling his teeth. Rivers attached the cable to the fallen trees, ran back to his tank, and roared the engine, dragging the obstacle clear. He did this not once, but repeatedly. He was clearing the path with his bare hands and his tanker's horsepower, essentially inviting every German sniper in the valley to take a shot at him. He cleared the road. The column surged forward. The white infantrymen watching from the ditches stared in disbelief. This was not the behavior of men who were scared of the dark, as the racist jokes went. This was the behavior of a warrior who simply refused to be stopped. But the Germans had more than roadblocks. As the 761st pushed into the town of Morville-les-Vic, they encountered the true horror of armored warfare. The town was a fortress. The fighting was house to house, street to street. A tank in an urban environment is a blind beast. Danger can come from any window, any cellar. It was in this crucible that Sergeant Warren G. Cressy emerged as a force of nature. Cressy was a mild-mannered, soft-spoken student from Texas. He was small, unassuming. But when he climbed into a tank, something changed. His men called him the baddest man in the 761st. During the assault, Cressy's tank was hit. It was disabled, dead in the water. Most crews would bail out and run for cover. Cressy bailed out, but he did not run. He saw a German anti-tank position that was devastating the American advance. He climbed onto a nearby jeep, grabbed a .30 caliber machine gun, and stood completely exposed in the middle of the street. He opened fire. He did not stop firing until the German nest was silenced. Then, he killed the observer directing artillery fire on his unit. By the end of the day, Cressy had essentially fought a one-man war. When they finally pulled him off the machine gun, he was shaking, not from fear, but from the adrenaline of a berserker rage. The mild-mannered student had become the Black Death, a nickname that would follow him through the war. The 761st took the town. They broke the German line. And they did it with a ferocity that stunned the white officers of the 26th Division. The reports that went back to Patton's headquarters were glowing. These men were not just competent, they were aggressive. They pushed their tanks to the limit. But the victory came with a cost that shattered any romantic notions of war. Tank warfare is brutal. When a Sherman gets hit by an armor-piercing shell, the physics are horrifying. The projectile punches through the steel, creating a spray of molten metal on the inside called spalling. It turns the interior of the tank into a blender. If the ammunition ignites, and in a Sherman, it almost always did, the tank becomes a furnace within seconds. The men of the 761st watched their brothers burn. They saw tanks brew up, turning into funeral pyres. They had to pull the charred remains of their friends out of the hatches. And they had to do it, clean out the tank, and get back in to fight the next day. This was the psychological burden. Every time they closed the hatch, they were sealing themselves into a potential tomb. And yet, they did not break. In fact, they got harder. They realized that the only way to survive was to kill the enemy faster than he could kill them. They developed a style of fighting that was fast, loose, and terrifyingly violent. They learned to fire their guns while moving, something the manual said was inaccurate, but which kept them alive. They learned to coordinate with the infantry, forming a bond of blood that transcended race. The white soldiers of the 26th Division, who had started the week skeptical, were now trading cigarettes and food with the black tankers. When you are pinned down in a muddy ditch and a black man in a Sherman drives up and blasts the machine gun nest that is trying to kill you, you stop caring about Jim Crow. You start caring about survival. The 761st was winning the respect of the front line, 176mm shell at a time. But the hardest test was still ahead. November turned into December. The rain turned into snow. The mud froze into rock-hard ruts. The Allied advance was overextended. The generals thought the Germans were finished. They were wrong. Adolf Hitler was planning one final, desperate gamble. A massive counter-offensive through the Ardennes forest, designed to split the Allied armies and capture the port of Antwerp. It would come to be known as the Battle of the Bulge. The 761st was right in the path of the storm. They were tired. Their tanks were breaking down. They had been in combat for weeks without a break, and they were about to face the elite of the Nazi war machine, the SS Panzer divisions. Ruben Rivers, the hero of the roadblock, was wounded. His leg was shredded by shrapnel. The jagged bone was visible. The medics told him he was done. They told him he was going home. He had $1 million wound, a ticket out of the hell of Europe. Rivers looked at the medic. He looked at his tank. He looked at his men, who were exhausted and scared. He knew that without his leadership, without his experience, they might not make it through the next fight. He refused the evacuation. "I'm staying," he said. "This is my fight." He climbed back into his tank, his leg bandaged, in agony, fueled by morphine and sheer grit. He was not fighting for the United States Army anymore. He was fighting for the 761st. He was fighting for the man next to him. He was fighting to prove that a black man could endure more pain, more cold, and more fear than the system ever imagined. The 761st revved their engines. The snow began to fall, blanketing the tanks in white. They were moving toward the town of Gebling. Ruben Rivers was in the lead. He was riding toward his destiny, and the Black Panthers were about to write their names in blood on the snow of the Ardennes. The experiment was over. The legend was beginning. By November 16, 1944, Staff Sergeant Ruben Rivers was a dying man. The shrapnel wound in his leg, sustained days earlier, had turned into a festering, agonizing mess. The bone was exposed. Infection was setting in. In any other war, in any other unit, he would have been strapped to a stretcher and sent to a rear echelon hospital in Paris to drink warm coffee and sleep in clean sheets. His war would have been over. His commanding officer, Captain David Williams, a white officer who had come to love and respect his black troops with a ferocity that alienated him from other white officers, begged Rivers to leave. He ordered him to leave. Rivers looked at his captain from the commander's seat of his Sherman. His face was grey with pain, his eyes sunken from days of fighting the infection and the Germans simultaneously. He shook his head. "Captain," he said, his voice raspy but steady, "it's going to be all right. I am spending my last days here." It was a prophecy. Rivers knew something the doctors did not. He knew that the 761st was the only thing standing between the German army and the annihilation of the 26th Infantry Division. He knew that his platoon, Able Company, drew its strength from his presence. If he left, the morale might crack. So he stayed. He injected himself with morphine to dull the agony, clamp his hands onto the controls, and drove on. 3 days later, on November 19th, near the town of Gebling, the hammer fell. The 761st was advancing across open ground when the German artillery trap was sprung. Hidden in the tree line, camouflaged perfectly in the morning mist, were the German anti-tank guns. They opened fire with devastating precision. The lead tanks were pinned down. The infantry was hugging the mud, unable to move. Rivers saw the flashes from the tree line. He knew where the guns were. He also knew that to expose his tank was suicide. But he had to buy time for the others to retreat and regroup. He keyed his radio. "I see 'em," he told his platoon. "We LL fight 'em." Rivers ordered his driver to charge. He drove his Sherman directly at the German guns, firing his 76mm cannon as he went. He made himself the biggest, loudest target on the battlefield. He drew the full fury of the German batteries onto his own hull. For a few miraculous minutes, he dueled with the hidden enemy, his shells smashing into the woods, suppressing their fire. He bought the time. The rest of Able Company pulled back to safety. Then, a high-velocity armor-piercing shell struck Rivers' tank. It did not bounce. It punched through the turret, creating a pressure wave that instantly killed Ruben Rivers. He did not just die, he sacrificed himself with a clarity of purpose that belongs in the history books alongside the Spartans at Thermopylae. Captain Williams, watching through his binoculars, wept. He immediately recommended Ruben Rivers for the Medal of Honor. It was the only appropriate award for what he had done. But this was 1944. The paperwork went up the chain of command, and then it stopped. The War Department, the Pentagon, the institutional racism of the era, somewhere in that bureaucratic void, the recommendation was lost. It was deemed that a black man could not receive the nation's highest military honor. They downgraded it. They ignored it. It would take 53 years, until 1997, for the United States to finally admit its sin and award the Medal of Honor to Ruben Rivers. By then, he was long dust, and his family had lived half a century knowing that their hero had been snubbed by the country he died for. The death of Rivers cast a pall over the battalion. But there was no time to mourn. The war was shifting gears. The autumn rains turned into the coldest winter Europe had seen in decades. The ground froze solid. The temperature plummeted to zero. And on December 16, 1944, the German army launched its last, desperate gamble, Operation Watch on the Rhine. The Battle of the Bulge. The Germans punched a massive hole in the Allied lines in the Ardennes forest. They sent 200,000 men and thousands of tanks crashing through the weak American defenses, aiming for the port of Antwerp. Chaos reigned. American units were overrun, surrendering by the thousands. The 101st Airborne was surrounded at Bastogne. General Eisenhower needed every available tank to plug the gap. He looked at the map, and he saw the 761st. Send the 761st. The order came down. They are the only ones close enough. The Black Panthers were ordered to race north, into the teeth of the German offensive. They drove their tanks over icy roads, sliding and drifting 30-ton steel monsters around hairpin turns in the dark. They arrived in Belgium to find a nightmare. The snow was waist-deep. The fog was so thick you could not see the end of your own gun barrel. And they were fighting the elite. They were not facing conscripts. They were facing the 13th SS Panzer Division and the Führerbegleiter Brigade. These were fanatics. They had superior Tiger and Panther tanks, machines that could kill a Sherman from a mile away. The conditions were medieval. The heaters in the Shermans did not work or could not be used because they drained the batteries. Inside the tanks, it was a freezer. Men's skins stuck to the steel. Frostbite became as dangerous as shrapnel. To make matters worse, the 761st, being a black unit, was at the bottom of the supply chain. White units received winter camouflage paint for their tanks. The 761st did not. Their olive drab tanks stood out against the white snow like bullseyes. But the 761st improvised. They raided local farmhouses and stole white bedsheets. They draped their tanks in linens to blend in. They wrapped their feet in burlap sacks to keep them from freezing. They adapted. And then, they attacked. Their objective was the town of Tillet. It was a critical junction, a knot in the German supply line that was strangling the Americans at Bastogne. If the 761st could take Tillet, they could cut the German advance in half. But Tillet was held by the SS. The battle for Tillet was a meat grinder. It was not a maneuver. It was a brawl. The 761st had to advance uphill, through deep snow, against dug in German heavy armor. For 2 days, they hammered away. They lost tanks. They lost men. But they kept coming. It was here that the brotherhood of the tank crew was tested to its limit. In a tank, there is no segregation. There is no rank. There is only the crew. the driver, the bow gunner, the loader, the gunner, the commander. If one dies, they all die. The men of the 761st developed a telepathic coordination. They learned to shoot and scoot, pop up over a ridge, fire around, and reverse before the German 88s could lock on. They used the speed of the Sherman to flank the lumbering Tigers, hitting them in the thinner rear armor. They fought with a ferocity that terrified the SS. German prisoners captured during the battle asked their captors, "Who are those men in the black tanks? They fight like devils." The irony was thick. The Nazis, the architects of the master race theory, were being crushed by the very people they considered subhuman. By early January, the 761st had broken the German grip on Tillet. They linked up with the 87th Infantry Division. They had plugged the hole. They had stopped the Panzers. The Battle of the Bulge was the turning point of the war on the Western Front, and the 761st had been right at the tip of the spear. But the victory was hollowed out by the reality of their existence. While they were bleeding in the snow, saving white American lives, the white American army was still treating them like pariahs. When the 761st pulled back from the line for a brief rest, they were denied entry to nearby towns where white soldiers were billeted. They were told to sleep in the fields, in the snow, because the good billets were for white troops. Imagine the psychological toll. You have just destroyed a German Panzer division. You have watched your friends burn to death in their tanks. You have frostbite on your toes. And a white MP tells you that you see not sleep in a warm barn because you might contaminate it. Any other group of men might have mutinied. They might have laid down their arms. Why fight for a country that hates you? Why die for a system that treats you worse than the enemy? But the 761st did not quit. They had a mission that transcended the US Army. They were fighting for the Double V. They were fighting to prove, once and for all, that they were the best. They channeled their rage into their gunnery. Every German tank they destroyed was a message to the Jim Crow South. Every mile they advanced into Germany was a mile walked toward their own dignity. As the snow began to melt and the Allies pushed into the German heartland, the 761st was about to encounter a horror that would dwarf the racism of home. They were about to drive their tanks through the gates of hell itself. They were heading toward the concentration camps. And what they would find there would change them forever, bonding them to the Jewish people in a shared understanding of what happens when hate is allowed to rule the world. The Black Panthers had survived the fire of combat and the ice of the Bulge. Now, they were about to look into the face of pure evil, and they would be the ones to smash the gates down. By February 1945, the 761st Tank Battalion had become a myth among the infantry divisions of the Third Army. They were the Black Panthers, a unit that seemingly never slept, never broke down, and never retreated. They had survived the mud of France and the snow of Belgium. Now, they stood before the very gates of Germany itself, the Siegfried Line. The Siegfried Line, or the West Wall, was Hitler's impregnable barrier. It was a 390-mile scar of concrete bunkers, pillboxes, and minefields stretching from the Netherlands to Switzerland. Its most iconic feature was the dragon's teeth, rows of pyramidal reinforced concrete anti-tank obstacles, designed to belly up a Sherman tank and leave it helpless for the artillery. The Germans believed it could not be breached. They believed the mongrel army of the Americans would break its teeth on this wall. General Patton assigned the 761st to lead the assault as part of Task Force Rhine. It was a suicide mission. To breach the line, the tanks had to drive slowly, single file, through narrow gaps cleared by engineers, while German guns rained fire from hardened bunkers that could withstand direct hits. The 761st did not flinch. They modified their tanks, welding steel teeth onto the front to cut through the hedgerows and earthworks. They developed a rhythm of destruction. They would pull up to a pillbox, deaf to the machine gun fire pinging off their hulls, and fire a 76mm high explosive shell directly into the firing slit. It was surgical violence. They cracked the dragon's teeth. They poured through the gaps like water through a breaking dam. On March 20th, 1945, the 761st smashed through the final defenses and entered the Rhineland. They were fighting on German soil. The psychological impact of this cannot be overstated. For the German civilians and soldiers, raised on a decade of Nazi propaganda that depicted black people as semi-animals, the sight of confident, well-equipped black men commanding massive war machines was a shock to the system. It shattered the myth of Aryan superiority more effectively than any pamphlet. Here were the Untermensch, driving the master race backward, town by burning town. The tempo was grueling. Most white tank battalions were rotated off the line after a few weeks of heavy combat to rest and refit. The 761st was not. Because they were a colored unit, there were no replacements. The army had not trained enough black tankers to create a reserve pool. So, the 761st just kept driving. They fought for 183 consecutive days. Let that number sink in. 6 months of waking up every morning knowing you might burn to death before lunch. They were exhausted, their nerves frayed, their uniforms rotting off their bodies. But they kept the engines running. As they pushed deeper into Austria in May 1945, the resistance began to crumble. The Wehrmacht was dissolving. But as the fog of war lifted, a new, darker fog descended. It started with the smell. It was a sickly, sweet, rotting stench that hung over the Austrian countryside, overpowering the smell of pine and diesel. The men of the 761st did not know what it was. They checked their engines, they checked their food. But the smell was coming from the wind. On May 4, 1945, the lead tanks of the 761st, scouting ahead of the 71st Infantry Division, rolled up to a complex of fences and guard towers near the town of Lambach. It was the Gunskirchen Lager, a subcamp of the notorious Mauthausen concentration camp. The German guards had fled hours before, terrified of the approaching black tanks. The 761st smashed through the gates, and what they found inside stopped them cold. Nothing in their training, nothing in the violence of the Bulge, nothing in the racism of the Jim Crow South could have prepared them for Gunskirchen. Inside the wire were 15,000 human beings who had been reduced to skeletons. Bodies were stacked like cordwood against the barracks walls. The living were indistinguishable from the dead, walking ghosts with hollow eyes, covered in sores and filth. The men of the 761st popped their hatches and climbed out. These were hardened warriors. They had seen heads blown off. They had seen bodies flattened by tracks. But as they walked into the camp, these men who had been told they were tough, broke down and wept. SGT. William Mac Burney later recalled the scene. "I felt like I was looking into the face of the devil," he said. The prisoners, mostly Jewish, but also political dissidents and others deemed undesirable by the Nazis, rushed toward the tanks. They had never seen black men before. Some of them, in their delirium, thought they were angels. They reached out with bony hands to touch the faces of the soldiers, to touch the steel of the tanks, to make sure it was real. The soldiers of the 761st did the only thing they could think to do. They emptied their tanks. They threw down their rations, their chocolate, their cigarettes, their water cans. They gave away their own lunches. They cut the locks on the storehouses. There is a profound and heartbreaking resonance in this meeting. On one side, you had the victims of the Holocaust, people who had been enslaved, tortured, and murdered because of their ethnicity. On the other side, you had the liberators, black men who had been enslaved, lynched, and segregated because of their race. In that muddy compound in Austria, two groups of people who had been targeted for destruction by the twin ideologies of white supremacy met. One group was dying, the other was holding the gun. The 761st looked at the starving Jews and saw the ultimate logic of racism. They realized that the hate they fought in Georgia and the hate they fought in Germany were the same beast, just different sizes. If you let the man who calls you nigger keep power long enough, eventually he builds a Gunskirchen. The liberation of the camps changed the 761st. It validated their sacrifice in a way that nothing else could. They were not just fighting for America anymore. They were fighting for humanity. They had looked into the abyss, and they had pulled the survivors out. Captain David Williams, their white commander, watched his men moving among the survivors, carrying the weak, feeding the hungry. He saw the gentleness in hands that, hours before, had been firing machine guns. He knew then that he commanded the finest human beings in the United States Army. A few days later, the news came over the radio. Germany had surrendered. The war in Europe was over. The celebration was raucous. The tankers fired their guns into the air. They drank captured German wine. They slept for the first time in 6 months without one eye open. They were the victors. They had done the impossible. They had taken their experiment and shoved it down the throat of the doubters. They had a combat record that was the envy of the army. Over 183 days of combat, 6,000 enemy casualties inflicted, hundreds of tanks destroyed, and thousands of prisoners captured. They had received 11 silver stars and 69 bronze stars. They packed up their tanks. They cleaned the mud of Austria off their tracks. They prepared to go home. They expected a hero's welcome. They did not expect a ticker-tape parade like the white troops, but they expected something. Acknowledgement. Respect. A thank you. They assumed that after saving the world might look at them differently. They thought that their blood, mixed with the soil of France and Germany, had bought them a ticket to first-class citizenship. They were wrong. As the ships carrying the 761st pulled into New York Harbor, the Statue of Liberty greeted them. But as they disembarked, the reality of America rushed up to meet them like a slap in the face. They were separated from the white units. They were told to wait. There were no reporters waiting to interview the Black Panthers. There were no mayors giving them keys to the city. There was just the military police, directing them to the colored train cars for the ride back to the south to be discharged. One soldier from the 761st, still wearing his uniform with his medals on his chest, was walking through a train station in Georgia on his way home. A white sheriff saw him. He did not see a liberator of concentration camps. He did not see a tank commander. He saw an uppity nigger in a uniform. The sheriff stopped him. He told him to take off the medals. He told him that boys did not wear medals in his town. And in that moment, the soldier realized the war was not over. The enemy had just changed uniforms. He had defeated the SS, but he could not defeat the sheriff. The Black Panthers had conquered Germany. Now, they had to survive America. And the hardest battle, the battle for their own history, was just beginning. The army that had used them was about to do the one thing worse than killing them. It was about to forget them. The silence that swallowed the 761st Tank Battalion after 1945 was not an accident. It was a policy. In the immediate aftermath of the war, the United States was busy constructing a narrative of victory that had no room for black heroes. The history books were being written, the movies were being cast, and the monuments were being designed. In this curated version of World War II, the face of the American G.I. was white. It was John Wayne. It was Audie Murphy. The Black Panthers, who had cracked the Siegfried Line and liberated concentration camps, were airbrushed out of the picture. They were disbanded, their members scattered back into the anonymity of civilian life, their unit records filed away in dusty archives that no one intended to open. For the men themselves, the transition was a psychological meat grinder. They had experienced a level of power and agency that was forbidden to black men in America. They had commanded 30-ton war machines. They had accepted the surrender of German officers. They had slept with white women in France and been toasted in English pubs. Now, they were expected to return to the Deep South and step off the sidewalk when a white man passed. They were expected to say yes sir to men who had not fought, had not bled, and had not saved the world. Many of them simply could not do it. The war had changed their molecular structure. You cannot put a tiger back in a kitten's cage. This tension, between the men they had become and the boys America wanted them to remain, became the fuel for the civil rights movement. It is no coincidence that the explosion of activism in the 1950s followed the return of these veterans. They had learned that the only way to defeat a tyrant, whether he wears a swastika or a white hood, is to stand your ground. The most famous example of this spirit was a man who never actually saw combat with the 761st in Europe, but whose soul was forged in the same fire. Lieutenant Jack Roosevelt Robinson. Before he was number 42, before he broke the color barrier in baseball, Jackie Robinson was a tank commander in the 761st. He was one of their best. He was tough, smart, and respected by the men. But in 1944, at Camp Hood in Texas, Robinson faced his own personal battle of the Bulge. He boarded a military bus and refused to move to the back. The white driver shouted at him. The military police were called. Robinson did not back down. He stood tall, articulate, and furious, challenging the racist laws on a federal military base. For this act of dignity, the Army court-martialed him. They tried to destroy him. They pinned false charges on him, accusing him of drunkenness and insubordination. The 761st watched closely. They saw their officer being railroaded. Robinson was eventually acquitted because the charges were so obviously fabricated, but the trial prevented him from deploying with his unit to Europe. He was transferred out. He missed the war. But when Jackie Robinson walked onto Ebbets Field in 1947, wearing a Brooklyn Dodgers uniform, he was fighting the same war the 761st had fought in the Ardennes. He took the abuse, the spit, the death threats, and he answered them with excellence. Every base he stole, every run he scored, was a tank shell fired at the heart of Jim Crow. The men of the 761st, watching from their living rooms, knew that look in his eye. They knew where it came from. He was a Black Panther, carrying the fight to a different battlefield. But while Robinson found fame, the rest of the battalion found only obscurity. They were denied the G.I. Bill benefits that built the white middle class. They were denied loans to buy houses. They were denied entry into the Veterans of Foreign Wars, VFW, halls in many towns. They were the invisible veterans. And the ultimate insult was the missing medal. After the war, virtually every unit that had performed with the distinction of the 761st was awarded the Presidential Unit Citation, PUC. It is the highest award a unit can receive, equivalent to every member winning a Distinguished Service Cross. The 101st Airborne got one. The 4th Armored Division got one. The 761st had been recommended for it immediately after the war by the white generals they had served under. General Paul Barter of the 35th Division had praised them. The paperwork was submitted. The case was slam dunk. And then, the paperwork disappeared. For decades, the Army claimed they could not find the recommendation. They claimed the files were lost. They claimed there was not enough documentation to prove the unit as heroism. It was a lie. The documentation was there. The will to acknowledge it was not. The Army in the 1940s and 50s simply could not bring itself to hang a blue ribbon on the flag of a black tank battalion. It would raise too many questions. It would upset the racial order. So, they stalled. The veterans of the 761st grew old waiting. They watched their comrades die of old age, heart attacks, and the lingering effects of war trauma, all without the recognition they had earned. They held reunions in hotel ballrooms, pinning their own medals on each other, telling their own stories because no one else would. They formed an alumni association, not just to reminisce, but to fight. They began a lobbying campaign that lasted 30 years. They wrote letters to congressmen who ignored them. They petitioned presidents who were too busy. They refused to let the issue die. It was not until the late 1970s that the tide finally turned. The civil rights movement had reshaped the political landscape. A new generation of historians was beginning to dig into the archives. And in the White House sat a president from Georgia, a man who understood the South and its sins, Jimmy Carter. The pressure mounted. The Army was forced to review the case again. And miraculously, when the political will changed, the lost files were found. The evidence that had been missing for 34 years suddenly appeared. The Army could no longer deny the undeniable. On January 24, 1978, a ceremony was held at the White House. It was a cold winter day, much like the days in the Ardennes. The surviving veterans of the 761st, now grey-haired men in their 50s and 60s, stood in formation. Some leaned on canes. Some were in wheelchairs. There were widows standing in for the men who had not made it. President Carter stood before them. He spoke of their bravery. He spoke of their sacrifice. He spoke of the injustice of the delay. And then, he awarded the Presidential Unit Citation to the 761st Tank Battalion. I present this to you, Carter said, not because you are black, but because you are the best. It was a moment of profound vindication. Tears streamed down the faces of men who had not cried when they saw their friends die in burning tanks. They finally had the ribbon. They finally had the respect. The record was corrected. But as they stood there, holding the citation, a bitter question hung in the air. Why? Why did it take 34 years? Why did Ruben Rivers' mother have to die without seeing her son honored? Why did so many men go to their graves thinking their country did not care? The award was a victory, but it was a scar. It was proof that in America, black heroism is treated differently. It has an expiration date. It requires extra proof. It is guilty until proven innocent. A white unit is assumed to be brave until proven otherwise. A black unit must prove its bravery over and over again, for decades, before it is believed. The 1978 ceremony closed the chapter on their official service record, but it opened a new chapter in the battle for memory. The 761st had their medal, but they still did not have their place in the cultural consciousness. Hollywood was still making movies about Patton where the only black people were driving jeeps or cooking food. The video games, the textbooks, the popular imagination still saw World War II as a white man's war. The veterans of the 761st realized that a medal in a drawer does not change history. Stories change history. So they kept talking. They wrote memoirs. They visited schools. They told the story of the Black Panthers to anyone who would listen. They were fighting against the great American amnesia. And then, in the 1990s, another injustice was unearthed. The case of Staff Sergeant Ruben Rivers, the man who had cleared the roadblocks with his bare hands. The man who had died charging a German battery to save his platoon. He still had not received the Medal of Honor. The Army had awarded 7 medals of honor to black soldiers in 1997, correcting a systemic bias that had denied any black soldier the top award during the war. Ruben Rivers was one of them. 53 years after his death, his sister, Grace, stood in the White House to receive the medal from President Bill Clinton. She was old and frail. She held the blue ribbon with the gold star, the symbol of supreme sacrifice. It was the end of a long, lonely road for the Rivers family. But as we look back at this saga of delayed justice, we have to ask ourselves, is an apology enough? Is a medal given half a century late truly justice, or is it just an attempt by the system to forgive itself? The men of the 761st did not fight for medals. They fought for the right to be men. They fought to prove that courage has no color. And they won that fight in 1944. The tragedy is that it took the rest of us so long to realize who won. As the 20th century ended and the veterans of the 761st began to fade away, leaving only their children and their stories, a new threat emerged. A threat not of suppression, but of appropriation. The history of the 761st began to be used by politicians and pundits as a prop. Look, they would say, America is not racist. Look at the 761st. They used the heroes to hide the crimes of the system that abused them. This is the final battle of the Black Panthers. The battle to ensure that their story is told fully, honestly, and with all its jagged edges. To remember not just the tanks they destroyed, but the Jim Crow laws they defied. To remember not just the victory in Europe, but the betrayal at home. And now, as we stand in the 21st century, the last of the Black Panthers are gone. The tanks are rusted. The battlefields are green fields again. But the question they pose to America remains unanswered. They gave everything. What did we give them back? The story is almost over. But the legacy is just beginning to be understood. And in the final chapter, we will look at what the 761st means for us today, and why their roar is still shaking the foundations of the history books. So, what is the final verdict on the 761st Tank Battalion? What is the weight of their legacy now that the last of the original crewmen has passed into history? To simply call them heroes is too easy. It is a word we use to comfort ourselves, to smooth over the jagged edges of a painful past. To say they were brave is an understatement so vast it borders on insult. The truth is far more complex, far more uncomfortable, and far more important. The 761st did not just win a military victory, they won a victory over the American imagination. Before November 1944, the prevailing image of the black male in the American mind was a caricature, subservient, fearful, incapable of complex thought or disciplined violence. The Army had institutionalized this caricature. They had built entire bases, written entire field manuals, and designed entire strategies around the lie that black men were children who needed white supervision. The 761st drove a 30-ton Sherman tank right through that lie. When they rolled through the towns of France and Germany, engaging the SS at point-blank range, they were not just destroying Panzers. They were dismantling the psychological infrastructure of white supremacy. They forced white generals to salute them. They forced white infantrymen to rely on them. They forced the German master race to surrender to them. They changed the optics of power forever. They proved that competence has no color, and that courage is not a racial trait, but a human choice. But their legacy goes even deeper than the battlefield. We have to look at what they birthed. The logo of the 761st, the snarling Black Panther, predates the Marvel superhero. It predates the revolutionary political party of the 1960s. The 761st were the originals. They were the first to take the symbol of the black cat, a creature often associated with bad luck or superstition, and turn it into a symbol of lethal, coiled power. They reclaimed the concept of black strength. And consider the timing. The men of the 761st return home in 1945 and 1946. They stepped off the trains in Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi, carrying the invisible armor of their service. They had looked death in the face in the Ardennes. They were no longer afraid of a sheriff in a sheet. They became the foot soldiers, the organizers, and the bodyguards of the civil rights movement. Medgar Evers was a World War II veteran. Amza Moore was a World War II veteran. The discipline, the logistics, and the sheer fearlessness that defined the civil rights struggle did not come from nowhere. It came from the barracks of the 761st and units like it. The civil rights movement was, in many ways, the final campaign of World War II, the campaign to liberate America. Yet, we must also reckon with the tragedy of their victory. They saved the world from fascism, but they could not save themselves from ingratitude. They fought a double V campaign, but they only got a single V. The victory abroad was total. The victory at home was partial, delayed, and grudging. For decades, the Army tried to treat the 761st as an anomaly. Yes, they would say, those men were good, but they were the exception. It took 50 years for the military to admit that the 761st was not the exception. They were the proof that the rule was wrong. The delay in awarding the Presidential Unit Citation and the Medal of Honor was not just bureaucracy. It was a desperate attempt by the old guard to hold on to the myth of white superiority for just a little bit longer. Acknowledging Ruben Rivers meant acknowledging that a black man could be the greatest warrior in the room. And for 1950s America, that was a terrifying thought. Today, the 761st is finally getting its due. There are monuments. There are documentaries. There is a renewed interest in their story. But we live in a time where history is once again under attack. There are voices today who want to ban books that talk about systemic racism. There are politicians who want to frame the American story as one of unbroken, unblemished glory. They want to talk about the liberation of Europe without talking about the segregation of the liberators. The story of the 761st stands as a bulwark against this whitewashing. You cannot tell the story of the Black Panthers without talking about Jim Crow. You cannot talk about their heroism without talking about the country that betrayed them. Their history is critical in every sense of the word. It is critical to the truth. It is critical to our understanding of what patriotism actually means. True patriotism, the 761st teaches us, is not blind worship. It is not ignoring your country's flaws. True patriotism is fighting for your country even when it hates you, in the hope that your sacrifice will force it to become what it promised to be. It is a love that is tough, demanding, and sacrificial. They loved America enough to die for it, even when America refused to let them live in it fully. That is a level of grace that is almost impossible to comprehend. So, when you see a tank today, or when you see a black general in the Pentagon, or when you see a protest for justice on the news, remember the men of the 761st. Remember the frozen mud of the Bulge. Remember the smell of the concentration camps. Remember the Ronsenleiters. They were the steel tip of the spear. They broke the line. They cleared the roadblocks, not just on the roads to Germany, but on the road to the future. We are the beneficiaries of their suffering. We live in the world they fought to create. And the debt we owe them can never be fully repaid with medals or ribbons. The only way to repay it is to refuse to let their story be sanitized. To refuse to let them become just another diversity statistic in a recruitment brochure. They were men. They were warriors. They were the Black Panthers. And they came out fighting. Now, the fight is ours. The fight against forgetting. The fight against the comfortable lie. The fight to ensure that the next generation knows that when the world was on fire, it was the unwanted men who grabbed the hose. This is the history they do not put in the textbooks. This is the reality of war that Hollywood ignores. If this story made your blood boil, if it made you proud, if it made you see World War II in a different light, then you have a duty. Do not let this video die here. The algorithm loves safe, simple stories. This is not a safe story. Prove the algorithm wrong. Hit that like button until it breaks. Share this with a friend who thinks they know history. Comment "Come out fighting" below to honor the men of the 761st. They drove their tanks through hell for us. The least we can do is keep their names alive. Subscribe to the channel. We are hunting down the truth, one forgotten hero at a time. The Panthers are watching.